one. My original training was humanities disciplines and classics and in the history of science. Then after many years in philosophy departments, I shifted over 6 years ago now into a department of cognitive science. I'd already been collaborating with cognitive psychologists, and that's sort of the most intense parts of my day job now is working as the sort of theoretician in a team on some work in cognitive psychology, which I'm going to talk about in the second half of this talk. So my aim today is not so much to present a single clear line of argument as to kind of romp in what I hope is an interesting way across a couple of different topics that I work on, primarily topics about memory on the one hand and distributed cognition on the other hand, with an attempt to kind of inspire you who know much more about web science than I do to see points of connection with the work on memory and distributed cognition in which I'm interested. So a couple of weeks ago, I was in the UK on this world tour, and I actually met people of a kind who I'd only heard about before. I'm particularly interested, for reasons that will become apparent, in cognitive interdependence in close relationships. An interest that, as Bryce told us yesterday, was there in Dan Wegner's work on transactive memory systems. And I met this couple, they're friends of my brother's actually, who've been living together for about 3 years, and we were talking about different forms of challenge that come up when you kind of move in together, and for them it was their books, right? So they each had a lot of books, the guy had very clear ideas about the principles of ordering, and so did the woman. But her principle was one that's perhaps less common among academics, at least. She likes to order the books by color along the shelf. So their compromise was that she can order the books by color within one shelf, but not the entire wall of the bookshelf. So people do organize their bookshelves by color, just as they have very idiosyncratic ways of organizing stuff on their desktop. It's why it's so weird when somebody else has been using your computer and shifting things around, or your ways of accessing information online. What I'm interested in, and what the sort of first pass at a very homely understanding of the notion of a distributed cognitive ecology, are these kind of idiosyncratic solutions to problems of managing material, managing space, and managing time. Things like the bookshelves show that these are things that actually really matter to people. In another real-life case, this is a long time ago now, but I knew a middle-aged man whose mother was living alone and was just starting to show signs of sort of more severe memory decline, and he was really worried for how hard it was going to be for her to continue managing on her own. And so he went in one weekend when she happened to be out, and reorganized all of her library. She was a very sort of literary person, into alphabetical order. Once she came home, she couldn't find a single book again. Put them in a bag and took them down to the second-hand shop. Kind of really tragic, right? These things matter to people. And there are challenges for many older adults, as I'm going to talk about later on, in sort of maintaining or re-establishing some navigable cognitive ecology, something that makes sense, that they can feel kind of routinized, stable, and secure in. So specific cognitive artifacts of the type that Andy Clark and many others have focused on, little devices and other things that we carry around with us, are nested in much larger systems. Systems of not just artifacts themselves, but of social practices and cognitive practices, which in turn are nested within lots of institutions that we live in. The cognitive ecology of an academic department is a nice example that would bear more research study than it's actually had. Just looking at the cognitive impact of social relationships, of place and building, and the organization of the members of the department around the committee room table. Obviously, a department like a sports team is a group in which there's pretty intense and pretty regular interpersonal interaction, usually in a very specific material and physical environment. That's the kind of level of a distributed cognitive ecology at a social level. That's the sort of maximum level of group of maybe a sort of sports team or a department where I think we can find the right kind of intensity of interaction to warrant being treated as a distributed cognitive system. Of course, the department is in a faculty, is in a university, is in all kinds of other larger scale systems, and questions about the scaling up of cognitive ecologies are very interesting, but that's the level of small group research that I'm focusing. So a little bit of background about this notion. We're epistemic engineers, as Kim Steroni and others have argued, who work by constructing our own niches. I think Richard talked about this last week. And these niches that we work in are cultural, physical, and technological all at once. They're things that we've made and that then alter and transform the cognitive requirements. And these resources are not outside our minds, at least not always. We incorporate, assimilate, and absorb them. These resources in the material and social world play distinctive roles in the kind of differently balanced solutions to all kinds of different problems. In the case of memory, my obsession, problems about managing the past and using the past to guide future action. So the study of cognitive ecology, like I suspect the study of web science, requires the very challenging integrated study of social processes distributed across many people, or at least across small groups of people, which requires us to look at the nature of the groups and the nature of the communicative interactions between the members, but also at materially and technologically distributed processes and resources, looking at the way that we use cognitive artifacts as individuals and groups. So the coordination of these quite disparate resources transforms our minds, and the kind of project of studying these cognitive ecologies requires, in my view, sort of finding rich and specific domains. So I'm interested in a sense, trying to bring together experiment with ethnography as methods for studying distributed cognition. So we want settings which integrate our movement in physical space, in buildings and in place, with our movements through social and interpersonal space, and increasingly with our lives in virtual space as well. Okay, so the plan for the talk then, I'm going to sort of pull back now to talk at a very general level about the taxonomy of forms of long-term memory I'm interested in. I suspect this is going to be very introductory and basic for most of you, but really what I want to do is just sort of put the taxonomy up here so that we can discuss now and over the next couple of days which kinds of remembering might be most interestingly transformed or influenced or interwoven with web technologies. Then I'm going to go back and say some more about this notion of distributed cognitive ecologies, connect it with some of the discussions about extended cognition we've been having, and talk a little bit about culture and history. And then the second half of the talk is discussing the empirical work in our group that I mentioned. I'm going to look at the ways that people remember together. Bryce said a lot about transactive memory systems yesterday, which helps me cut some corners there. I'm going to give a slightly different take on transactive memory, and then specifically look at what happens when somebody like poor old Otto with his notebook is out there in the real world. Okay, so forms of long-term remembering. So I can remember specific things I did the last time I was in Montreal. I remember having dinner at a beautiful restaurant up the road. I also remember that I was in Montreal one winter years ago, even though I don't have many sort of vivid memories except for that sort of visceral shiver of remembering how cold it was. I also remember how to do many things, how to ride a bike, how to play certain sports shots, and so on. So this is your basic sort of roughly consensual taxonomy of memory in cognitive neuroscience, where episodic or personal or experiential memory and semantic memory are both forms of declarative memory, which really means just that they make claims on the world, that they can be true or false. Procedural memory involves both cognitive and motor skills and ranges across a whole array of forms of and levels of complexity, from quite low-level forms of associative conditioning to much more complex and human-specific forms of skill and habit memory. Now, there's a lot of dispute both about whether this taxonomy of forms of long-term memory sort of has much integrity and use, but also even among those who do accept something like this about the precise criteria by which we distinguish these forms of memory. Among psychologists, at least, it's not too popular to distinguish them simply by reference to grammar. There is a different grammar that we use, and this holds across many different languages, though not all. So that remembering specific personal events is usually expressed in a gerundive clause. I remember walking up the hill to dinner last night. But we presume that there's a difference in content that underlies this, that episodic memories are, at least in the sort of paradigm case, memories of specific and in principle datable past events in my personal history, in contrast to my memories of general facts. But for many psychologists, there's also a difference in relation to the phenomenology or the experience of remembering episodically compared to remembering semantically. Sometimes this is described as the difference between really remembering and merely knowing, or for Tulving, there's the sort of technical term autonoesis, sort of knowing that yourself was there in the past, so the self-consciousness of yourself over time. But I suppose the dominant view in cognitive neuroscience is that ultimately these kinds of memory have to be distinguished by finding different mechanisms, different underlying mechanisms. And in a sense, for me, the most powerful reason to accept this taxonomy is the existence of dissociations across all of the different kinds. You can lose one without losing the others. But there are really significant and unsolved questions about the unity of an overarching kind memory. How well does it really apply across the board? Are procedural memories, for example, really an instance of the same kind as declarative memories? I'm not going to sort of attempt any responses to this today. What I want to leave you with, because I think this is relevant to the kind of more applied research that we might see in web science, is that, in a sense, the point of these distinctions between different forms of remembering is that we can then go on an empirical practice to look at the ways in which these kinds of remembering interact. Right? Sometimes they're in conflict, and sometimes you can set up experimental situations so that there's a competition between different kinds of memory. But much more commonly in ordinary life, our episodic and semantic and procedural memories are all working together, complementing each other in concert. But they can operate at different timescales and in different ways. And so I use the notion of autobiographical remembering, which is sometimes used kind of synonymously with episodic memory, but I use autobiographical remembering to include, for example, personal semantic knowledge about the place that I lived when I was a kid, which I don't vividly, experientially remember. And in autobiographical remembering of many kinds, often these three kinds of memory are kind of actively interanimating each other. And the way that we work with our past is very often mediated in interesting ways by factors outside our individual brains. And that's the link between the memory project and the study of distributed cognitive ecologies. Now, each form of remembering involves a range of different resources in different kinds of combinations. All of these have distinctive neural patterns. Often, though not always, they have distinctive emotional patterns. They often involve kinesthetic sensations, so even autobiographically remembering, like walking up the hill last night, will often bring along with it either an active motor movement or at least the tendency to feel myself walking up the hill and the bodily effort there. There are crucial sensory components, at least again to episodic memory, a whole array of phenomenological signs or markers and all kinds of cognitive accompaniments. That's no news, right? And all the major models of episodic memory, for example, in the literature, for example, Martin Conway's model or David Rubin's model, are kind of about how these different internal resources combine and operate together to produce episodic memory. But, and again, this is not, incredible news to psychologists. These forms of memory often all involve external resources as well. They can involve the mediation of technological, material, social, and interpersonal cultural resources. So on this view, some activities of remembering span or are distributed across or become hybrid across complementary resources which are both inside the skull, in the body, and in the external world. So, for example, we might say of Otto, who's using his notebook in Clark and Chalmers' famous case, that Otto remembers that MoMA is on 53rd Street, where that remembering is, in a sense, mediated by the information in his notebook. We might say, in a case of socially distributed remembering, we remember seeing that show together on our honeymoon, and I'll give you an example of that in a moment. We remember how to move that sofa upstairs, right? This particular sofa around that awkward sort of bend in the stairs. It may be that it would take a real effort to show somebody else how to do that, but you too, you and your partner, remember how to do that. You and your favorite dance partner remember how to dance the tango. Again, you can dance with somebody else, but it's not the same, right? So here's an example of shared remembering of the second kind here. This is a kind of shared autobiographical memory. This is from studies we've done with couples who've been together for 30 or 40 years, and this is a husband and wife who are talking about their honeymoon in the late 1940s. This is a very older couple. The wife says, "We went to 2 shows. Can you remember what they were called?" Husband, "We did. One was a musical, or were they both?" "I don't know." One. Wife, "John Hanson was in it." Husband, "Desert Song." "Desert Song, that's it. I couldn't remember what it was called, but yes, I knew John Hanson was in it." Yes. So what's striking about this case of kind of iterative cross-cueing is that both parties have said they don't remember. Now, there's nothing magical or mysterious about this. Obviously, the information was there in at least one of their brains, but only by this integrative process of exploiting the transactive memory system, of working together over these few conversational turns, do they manage to get it. So the picture of the brain that underlies this picture is that brains are highly plastic. Clark says human brains are unusually incomplete. They're richly structured but constantly changing, and they're prone to absorb, to transform, to kind of update and respond to different kinds of patterns in the input. And they're densely externally interconnected as well as internally interconnected to the body and the world and other people. Brains here then are, as well as being natural, they're also cultural artifacts or kind of biosocial organs, which are maintained by the conditions, the cultures, the institutions, the artifacts and activities which we ourselves collectively over time have created and maintained. So the processes of remembering, perceiving, and so on are furiously active. They're incorporating, they're selecting, they're integrating material from many different sources. Cognitive ecology is sort of just a label, a convenient label for trying to study these sorts of processes, studying systems of relations among cognitive processes in some community of interest, in some setting of interest. It's the study of webs of mutual dependence among the elements of a cognitive ecosystem, an ecosystem which is organized and updated and changed and transformed itself in interaction across a range of timescales. Cognitive ecologies are the multidimensional context in which we remember, think, feel, sense, communicate, imagine, and act, often collaboratively, on the fly, in rich ongoing interaction with our environments. So this picture is just a kind of updating or slight rebranding maybe of what I previously called second wave extended cognition theorizing or complementarity-based or integration-based versions of the extended cognition hypothesis. This goes back very clearly to some of Clark's earliest work on the topic. The argument for the extended mind, he said, turns primarily on the way disparate inner and outer components cooperate to yield integrated, larger systems capable of supporting various forms of adaptive success. The reason I'm sort of adopting this new terminology is that the word extended has caused much more trouble than it's worth in extended cognition or extended mind. It seems to suggest that there is a kind of unsullied individual that is the source or the heart of our cognitive life, and thus ignores the sort of the really important developmental Vygotskian inspiration for a lot of these ideas that, in a sense, cognitive processes and capacities soak in from our immersion in a rich cultural environment. And while we're at it, it would be really useful to get rid of the words cognition and mind as well. Cognition, you know, for someone like me who works in a cognitive science center, I don't know what it's like in French, but many people outside academia says, oh, you work on cognition, so you ignore emotion. And I go, oh, that's, no. That's the word mind. You know, everybody thinks they know what it means. But I think it's not an accident, and it's an interesting fact, and, you know, one with interesting cross-cultural, cross-linguistic, cross-semantic aspects to it, that we don't really have a successful umbrella word that unifies all of these different things. So in anti-Platonist spirit, what I usually do at this point is just list lots and lots of different things that we all agree are clearly cognitive processes: remembering, judging, feeling, thinking, decision-making, acting, communicating, and so on, and let the list do the work. So this complementarity route to this distributed idea, and the point then is that we already have this word, this label, distributed cognition. It long predates Clark and Chalmers' argument, quite independent traditions in cognitive anthropology and situated cognition, so we should just stick with that term. Complementarity focuses our attention on the fact that the internal resources in the brain and the body are quite different from the external resources, most obviously in technological media with which we interact. So these are quite heterogeneous, quite distinct, quite different components, the neural processes and the external components of these coupled interactive systems. So where there's a kind of rich cognitive interdependence, it's not because there's the similarity between what's going on in my head and what's going on in the world, it's rather because they're operating together effectively. The point is then to direct our attention to these full cognitive ecologies, and the word ecology here is just doing the work of trying to look at the shifting balance of resources in any specific such setting. It motivates the integrated study of embodied brains and external symbols, exograms as the kind of the external version of engrams or brain traces or memory traces, and institution that is in these transformative relations. Clark again, the computational power and expertise is spread across a heterogeneous assembly of brains, bodies, artifacts, and other external structures. So applying to memory then, and I mean, from now on, when I'm talking in the abstract about memory, I'm talking certainly about declarative memory, and I've primarily got episodic personal remembering in mind. Cognitive ecologies of memory change and evolve over time. Historical variation, technological variation, changes in culture, changes in cognitive practices are not sort of external to memory on this sort of view. They're not just things for historians or anthropologists or, you know, quirky humanists to study in their dusty libraries, but rather they are the means and the medium of variation in mind and memory itself. If we are, as Clark says, natural-born cyborgs, then the advent of new digital technologies is just kind of the latest chapter in something that's characteristic of our species and has always been, that we've always distributed our minds. We've always been apt for incorporation, for the incorporation of artifacts and other resources which we ourselves have created. Now, in Carr's famous article that Google makes us stupid, he kind of, in a way, sort of pulls the rug out from under his feet by quoting this famous passage from Plato's Phaedrus. I've never used this in a talk before, but a web science talk seems like precisely the right point to lug it out. You all know this. Socrates is discussing the invention of writing. This is put in a kind of mythical context. The invention of writing, this discovery of yours will create forgetfulness in the learner's souls because they will not use their memories. They'll trust to the external written characters and not remember of themselves. They'll hear many things and will have learned nothing. Right? This is kind of like a lot of complaints about Google. They will appear to be omniscient and will generally know nothing. They will be tiresome company. Right? Did you read what was on Facebook this morning, by the way? Having the show of wisdom without the reality. So the point of pulling this back here is to suggest that every new technology, and every technology has a kind of a backlash, a moral panic about the degrading effects on our native biological capacities. If you like, a sort of internalist reaction to say that true memory, true mind is internal. All of this external stuff is bad news. Just one example from more recent history. This is a very vitriolic debate between two historians. A kind of this is about 16th century effects of increasingly widespread printing in Europe, a sort of later version of debates about orality and literacy. So Elizabeth Eisenstein, author of that massive, extraordinary book, The Printing Press as an Agent of Change, is summarizing her view. Print, she says, helped to reorder the thoughts of all readers. So a massive sort of determining influence of cognition comes from the widespread use of print technologies in the early modern period. Her nemesis, a historian of the book, Adrian Johns, says no. You know, in Eisenstein's work, readers suffer the fate of obliteration. Their intelligence and skill is reattributed to the printed page. So it's kind of like, do guns kill people, or do people kill people? And as with that debate, you know, it just needs to be reinterpreted, right, in a more balanced way so that we can look at a shifting set of cognitive ecologies as technologies change. Of course, artifacts, technologies, cultures alter cognition, but that's sort of not the dramatic, world-shattering point that Eisenstein was trying to make, because cognition is always changing and is always radically diffuse and different, even within a given population. People use the same technologies in radically different ways from each other. And by, if you like, putting the whole rug smooth, by treating a distributed cognitive ecology as not just, the core cognition in the head and then external stuff merely influencing or triggering that, by treating it all as part of the same integrated system, we can then analyze, we can then study the real and the interesting, subtle differences between different kinds of ecologies and different ways of inhabiting and using the same ecology. For a couple of slides, I'm just going to sort of do some hand-waving just to say that especially people studying web science and studying new digital technologies, I think it's really important to sort of have a historical and a social scientific and a kind of anthropological wing on this, so that you're not sort of just sucked into thinking that the developments that are happening now are the only interesting ones that can happen. There's an enormous amount of fascinating work in cognitive archaeology, cognitive history, and in related disciplines, where the idea is to give really rich, historically specific, culturally anchored accounts of specific technological practices, specific social uses of technologies, including the study of the cognitive life of things in different contexts, from sort of prehistoric artifact use and creation, tool use and so on, right through to print technology, right through to our extraordinary complex digital world. And this is a picture of Lynn Tribble, who's a Shakespeare scholar, who was who's the scholar that whose work Bryce was referring to yesterday in her work on cognition in the globe. So this is one of her books, Cognition in the Globe, Attention and Memory in Shakespeare's Theatre, which is a full statement of that point that Bryce was making yesterday about. This is an analysis model explicitly on Hutchins' account of cognition in the wild, about how actors were embedded in these rich physical and social and poetic ecologies. But she's also co-authored with a historian of religion, Nick Keane, this other book, Cognitive Ecologies and the History of Remembering, and I'm just going to say a little about that. This is taking the English Reformation, connected up with the larger European Reformation, the sudden availability of a religious alternative within Christianity in the form of Protestantism. Now, this is a fabulous case for distributed cognition, because the explicit topic of some of the most vitriolic, violent debates between Catholics and Protestants in the 16th and 17th centuries is about how much should cognition and experience be distributed and extended on artifacts in the sensory and architectural extravagance, as Protestants saw it, of Catholic religion? Or how much should it be the direct relation of the individual mind to the divine, as in Protestantism? And so there's an increasing attempt in Protestant theology and in practice to kind of wean ourselves off external resources. And so it's easy to see this as a sort of a battle of distributed cognition against internalism. But of course, that's not the way that Tribble and Keane see this. They see it as a battle between two distinct regimes of material cognition, of integrated cognitive ecologies that Protestants have to create, often quite silently, quite tacitly, an entirely new regime of attention in the church. I've just listed there a number of other historical topics that are ripe for analysis from a distributed cognitive perspective. Okay, so now to try to come back to our core topics. Does the web extend the mind? Well, I don't know, maybe in some particular ways, and I'll try and say a little bit more about how it might happen. But what I want to argue is that to approach that question, not to answer that question, we should be seeking not criteria to decide yes or no, but rather dimensions on which to analyze distinct cases. We want to say that cognition is not always equally distributed, or perhaps a better way to put that is it's not always distributed in the same ways across distinctive ecologies. The criteria that have come up in a number of talks already, whereby an external resource like Otto's notebook has to be accessible, it has to be more or less reliable, and it has to be more or less automatically endorsed to count as part of Otto's cognitive processes and as part of his cognitive system. So these criteria are matters of degree, and in my view this is a really good thing, and it should have helped us in the extended cognition literature to see that we're not looking for a yes or no, all or nothing, black or white answer to the question of does X extend the mind or not. They're matters of degree which apply differently across contexts. You know, Sean Gallagher has made a lot of these points in some recent work. Sean Gallagher, the phenomenologist and philosopher of mind, but he then goes on to say that this shows Clarke's criteria are wrong-headed because they're matters of degree, whereas in my view that's precisely their strength. So we're just going to spend a minute talking about the development of multidimensional frameworks for distributed cognition, the idea of studying distinctive but characteristic mixes of resources in interactive coupled systems. So I'm just going to skip through this. This is where I see the heart of work on distributed cognition and extended cognition operating at the moment. These are just some of the dimensions that different theorists have argued are kind of really important, really central. I'll just say a little bit about these two. In a sense that the heart of Clarke's account of extended cognition is to focus on the intensity of interaction between the different elements within a set of coupled system. Right? It's because Otto is constantly using his notebook. There's an intensity of interaction, and we're also meant to imagine him entering the information there and repeatedly updating it. This can, of course, happen for Clarke with relatively brief, relatively transient cases in which a certain set of resources is not necessarily constantly available. Clarke at least wants to argue that that can still be a case of extended cognition if the interaction is sufficiently intense. Secondly, I just want to point to the importance of transparency in use. Again, we've heard quite a bit about this from a number of speakers so far, that it's vital to understand that in the cases Clarke and Chalmers describe it, Otto doesn't have to first go, oh gee, I'd better look up my notebook. He just does it, right? So there's the equipment is ready to hand. The point of this multidimensional framework then, whatever the dimensions turn out to be and however hard it's going to be to quantify them and measure them, is to turn what looked like a metaphysical distinction into an empirical space where we can do tractable empirical studies looking at different cases and locating them at different points in this space. And this should include both social cases of distribution and cases of cognitive ecologies which include artifacts such as technological and web resources. There can be a whole range of different relationships between agents and their artifacts which are constantly renegotiated and reconfigured. And this allows us, I mean, Mark said at the beginning of his talk that cognition is not always extended, and I think this is my take on how to interpret that line of thought, that there are cases, imagine this multidimensional space, in which there's very little distribution intensity of interaction going on at all. Some people, most of us know some people like this, are much more like that than others. There are individual differences here that are very strongly. Some people shield themselves from reliance on external artifacts and from other people. Some people are the type who kind of generally know, right, they'll have uploaded it to their own brains what the relevant train timetable is, or what's in their fridge, whereas the rest of us would just go and look, right, to find out and have left the information in the world. So some people shield themselves in some contexts more successfully from these wider cognitive ecologies, and that's kind of approximating individualism, but it's sort of just one corner of this multidimensional space. And the job of the analyst, the job of the theorist and the scientist is to map the whole space, including kind of, if you like, the opposite corner, the top right corner in this multidimensional space, where cases score much higher on the interesting dimensions of interactivity, procedural transparency, reciprocal connectedness, and so on. Now, to try to apply this picture very sort of crudely to web, I mean, my understanding is that most of our cognitive interactions with the web are relatively unidirectional, relatively sort of passive in that the stuff online isn't changed by what we do with it in general. We're absorbing, we're consuming. Sometimes we put something down, but then that just stays there. And they involve relatively low intensities of interaction. So in not many cases is there ongoing iterative reciprocal change between the user and the web artifact. So this looks like a classic case in which of complementarity, in which the inner resources in the agent's brain and the external resources, in this case the web technologies, have kind of roughly fixed properties which differ dramatically from each other. The external symbol systems, as Merlin Donald had argued about exograms, external symbol systems since the origins of behavioral modernity, exograms are relatively permanent. You know, stuff out there in the world has the advantage of staying there, of not dying when the knower dies, and of being relatively unlimited in terms of capacity. You can keep writing stuff on the web. They can be changed into different media in many cases, and they're reformatable. But it doesn't have to be like that, and I think a lot of the things we've been hearing about, many of the most interesting things in web science, are cases in which those more sort of passive aspects of web data and of our interactions with web data can be either already or are imaginable as being more dynamic. So in the case of Otto, you know, imagine changing his notebook for something that does something a lot more active, right? That's for some dynamic new media system, which incorporates a whole range of sensory access to the world of its own, and which might augment the reality that he moves through as he's wandering through the streets of New York. And it might well be collectively updatable, right? Otto may have a group of mates or his family who are able to access and update the information in his notebook remotely. And it might then highlight information. It might sort of do some selection, some user-specific, contextually specific suggestions that might be aligned with Otto's moods or emotions. Now, I'd written about this before in the merely science fiction context of Neil Stephenson's extraordinary, wonderful fantasy book, Diamond Age, in which a core part of the plot of that book is this Young Ladies Illustrated Primer, which is a book created in the story by those in power. It's a sculpted, personalized, individual technology that is meant to go to the highly privileged young girl and sort of help her learn her place in the world. But it gets stolen and it gets given to a girl from the wrong side of the tracks, Nell, and because it still has its properties and capacities which work on a very unique idiosyncratic basis, that both Nell and this book, the primer, alter and transform themselves, develop themselves in mutual interaction, in a kind of cognitive interdependence over time. It works through a whole array of interactive technologies. It has all kinds of dynamic databases. It also has live actors, or ractors as they're called in the story, sort of working at a distance, with some of whom Nell develops a particular relationship. So fabulous, invention of Stephenson's just at the beginning of the internet age. And until recently, I'd sort of thought this was just fantasy, and I've just been sort of hunting around for the influence of this, and it turns out that actually there have a number of technological projects directly influenced by Young Ladies Illustrated Primer, right? Science sort of was pre-shadowed by fiction by sort of 15 years. Explicitly, Nell, the narrative environment for learning how to learn. This is a system that involves a narrative interface. It can be given to kids. These are all systems for kids in disadvantaged backgrounds. With no teacher, it uses a sort of story-based system that can be updated, and it has decentralized authorship, the open code that can be altered from different locations. It's personalized. There's the kind of record of past choices and achievements. You know, it's not that different from a lot of more passive learning games, but it's also growable, that both for the community of users and the child herself, it can teach about itself, and ideally the child can then learn to program it. And a related but slightly different initiative it comes from the One Laptop Per Child initiative, and this is a picture from Ethiopia Ethiopia, where these packages with individualized laptops were just dropped there, sealed up, and they were left to see what happened. And of course, the kids open them up and start to work out how to use them themselves. And they're being tracked remotely. They work on solar power, so they don't run out in Ethiopia. And the researchers at MIT can track what's being used, what apps are being downloaded, huge numbers of apps within a few days of the kids opening these things up. And they've been preloaded with a lot of sort of literacy learning tools. And so this is an ongoing experiment to see what happens when you just let the kids learn themselves in the way that the Young Ladies Illustrated Primer did. One of the things that the researchers at the moment are looking at is that in this completely teacherless environment, it's very hard to kind of get motivation to continue driving your own learning. But a fascinating sort of case of something that looks like a more dynamic, potentially more dynamic web technology. Okay, now I'm just going to, how long have I got?
You still have
10 more? Yeah, because we started a bit late. So I'm going to just skip through a couple of points about transactive memory systems, and I'll just summarize them now before I skip through to what I really want to talk about for the last few minutes about Otto in the wild. So Bryce talked about transactive memory systems as cases of cognitive interdependence, where the outputs that are kind of integrated over time among members of a dyad or a closely knit team can be emergent in various ways, could be slightly more than the knowledge or the memory of the sum of the parts. Now, transactive memory research has had a lot of impact in organizational psychology in particular. And one of the problems with it is that the comparison group, when transactive memory theorists say that working together in, for example, a memory problem or a problem-solving task is better than working alone, thank you, is that the comparison group isn't adequate. If you like, this framework puts the bar too low because it compares what one person can do with what a group of people can do, full stop. And the conclusion almost always is a group of people can perform better. The bar is too low because the right kind of comparison group, and as has been produced in cognitive psychology for over 15 years now under the label of collaborative recall experiments, is to get a group working together, say a group of 3, but then have a set of 3 individuals who work separately, but where we then pool the independent results of the group of 3, and we call this the nominal group. We pool the non-redundant, non-overlapping outputs. For example, if you're remembering a word list, you pool together the results of all of the individuals in that group, and you compare them to the results, the output of the group of 3 who are working together. And I'll just show you the typical results here. The key result is collaborative inhibition. This is, yeah, sure, individual doesn't do very well, but look, a group working together performs less well, produces less, remembers less than a nominal group, i.e. the same number of people working together with their outputs then pooled. Now this is a kind of annoying and bewildering result for those of us who are interested in collective and collaborative processes. So what I'm going to skip over in the next slides is just to talk you through ways that in our research group we've been trying to kind of tweak the ways in which collaborative recall experiments are done, and to, for example, use groups where the members know each other, and to use much more interactive processes of collaboration, and to see if we can produce more results where at least the collaborative inhibition effect is eliminated. And just one of the set of results that we found is that if you work with material where the members of the group have generated it together, if they've done some shared encoding, right, if the learning phase is learning material that the group members have worked together, then the collaborative inhibition effect is reversed. Then they will remember that material much better if they're working together as a group than if you send them apart as individuals. So this is a kind of a collective version of the generation effect in individual memory. Okay, get through the, because I want to get so. So we've been looking at a whole range of long-standing groups. So instead of studying these processes with groups of first-year undergraduates who don't know it, we want to look at groups where there's a rich shared history, where there may be goals, and where there's a shared process for action and communication that's developed over time. So we've looked at an array of groups: friends, siblings, twins, high school reunion groups, sports teams, work groups, and so on. But the rest of my last few minutes is about couples, people who've been living together for many years. So Otto, in Clark and Chalmers' story, right, it's kind of out there on his own, the poor guy, with his notebook. In the real world, yeah, sure, some poor people suffering Alzheimer's are on their own, but it's much more common for them to be embedded in a rich social and material network. At least before somebody with Alzheimer's has to go into a care facility, there's often families, carers, different generations of support. So we're interested in the distributed cognitive ecologies of incipientia. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about some studies we've done with older couples who do not have any memory decline. A few of them had some memory complaints, but we're now using these same methods on subjects who are subjective memory complainers, who say my memory is much worse than it used to be, and also on people diagnosed with mild cognitive impairment, a precursor to Alzheimer's. Just a couple of the things that the couples say as sort of metacognitive or meta-memory guidelines. We used to have a rule, says one husband, that if we're telling a story and I say there were 10 wild dogs in the back garden, I don't want my wife to tell me no, there's only 2. If I'm telling a good story and I said there were 10 wild dogs, then there were 10 wild dogs. Another husband said, what we find is because we've done everything, someone will start telling a story and the next person will take over and tell another funny part of the story. If you're not careful, you don't know who has the right to the story. We found this very commonly, a kind of swapping of ownership of the past. Some cases where one party had actually not experienced an event themselves, but they come in memory to own it just as much as their partner does. We're particularly interested in extending this to people with some memory difficulties because of a really puzzling set of results in the medical and neuroscientific literature on Alzheimer's. So in control studies, where people suffering Alzheimer's are compared over time with adults of the same age who show no memory difficulties, no memory complaints, right? If those control subjects then die for unrelated reasons, at post-mortem across a range of studies, anything from kind of 20 to 30%, almost up to a third of control subjects, end up having neuropathology of an Alzheimer's type that, on merely inspecting the brain, would suggest that they would have exhibited some signs of severe memory decline. And yet they haven't. They've been managing perfectly fine in the wild, in the world. Now, obviously, a lot of this is to do with neuroplasticity. When there's trouble in the hippocampus, right, other parts of the brain can reroute and take over. But we don't think that's the only kind of plasticity. We think there are also external compensatory mechanisms, social and technological mechanisms. We can take a cue here from Dan Dennett, who wrote that older individuals load their home environments with ultra-familiar landmarks, triggers for habits. Taking them out of their homes, then, is literally separating them from large parts of their minds. And we're interested in ultimately in trying to work out how to predict which older individuals may more successfully cope, right, with losing a partner or with going into a care facility where they don't have those ultra-familiar landmarks. So I want to just finish with some of the data we've gathered on the way that older couples use material aids, material technologies. We haven't so much been looking at the use of web technologies, but at any kind of artifacts like calendars or whiteboards and so on. I'm just going to skip through some other results here to this material and technologies of remembering in older couples. So this is just part of a sort of an array of studies with these couples. So definitely, in both quantitative and qualitative data, we showed that they have significant reliance on external aids. Do you use the calendar a fair bit? It's our Bible. It's your Bible. It is our Bible. We've got a diary and a telephone book, and we've got a book on birthdays. I don't try to remember things. This is the same as the Google effect that Bryce was talking about yesterday from Wegner. I don't try to remember things because you try, you don't. The diary is a means of coordinating the use of the car and our different interests. It's a key thing. It's the structure of our lives, right? So people sort of showing the extent of their reliance on certain kinds of technologies. Now, men especially, these older men, the 70s and 80s, are often quite reluctant to avow their reliance on external technologies. And often that's kind of not surprising because it turns out they channel that reliance through their wives. Right? These are people of a certain generation, right? I don't use the calendar, one husband told us, but Thelma, his wife, sort of refers to it constantly and she'll remind me, so she's a constant reminder. Another man said, I don't use memory aids. Oh, hang on, Glenys carries a diary with her all the time. If she's got the diary, we're always together, and that's it. So that's an example of a persisting integrated system, I would say. So we want to look at these networks of the wife, the husband, and their technologies as coupled systems, which can operate in many different ways. And we found a lot of different results across these different couples. This is just where at the moment we're trying to sort of work out a qualitative scheme for analyzing the dimensions where we can then put specific couples at different places in this taxonomy. Maybe I'll just pick out a couple of these dimensions. One of the most difficult things, and this is going to be even more important when we start looking at older adults with memory problems, is updating. So who puts the data onto the whiteboard or the personal digital organizer? You can't always leave it to the person who needs to remember their appointment. They may be the one with the least reliable internal memory. And yet, in many households, there's more than one artifact that carries information. Some of the individuals have a diary, and then there's something up in the kitchen as well. Now, this is one area where I think there's a lot of interest in current technological research on automatic updating of artifacts on an online basis. So if, for example, one memory of a member of a family or a community has some memory decline, and they're out in the world doing stuff with one person, some new information comes into the home. Well, we need to tell so-and-so that the appointment's been moved to 4 o'clock, not 3 o'clock. We need some way of updating different systems simultaneously. So there are a whole range of different patterns in the way that couples use these external resources and work with each other, different forms of cognitive interdependence, and we can't separate their use of material and technological resources from the way that they work with each other. But there are different kinds of dynamic, more or less well-coordinated systems of ways of managing the past and the future for both prospective memory and remembering their past. I haven't given you any data from the studies we did of their memories of their own past events, but we also tested them, as well as with sort of lab tests like word tests, on memories of their own past experiences, their shared holidays, things like their honeymoons, their first date. And we did that in the same paradigm as the collaborative recall work in the lab, by first getting them to tell us everything about these events or occasions individually, and then putting them together and to see what happens. And often you get quite radically different results, kind of qualitatively as well as quantitatively, when they're talking about the past together. So just to finish, these older couples incorporate tools and technologies in dynamic and coordinated ways, but they're systems that you don't always get at by asking the individuals alone, and often not by asking the dyad either, that you have to kind of observe these in practice, because the strategies are often very tacit, they're hard to see. When couples don't collaborate successfully in remembering or in planning or in working together, it's not always easy to see why. I skipped through some results we worked with that looked at the kind of microstructure of communication as couples are working together on a memory task, and we found one very direct predictor of failure in a memory task, or of poorer performance in a memory task, is just constant corrections. And this may strike some of you, from personal experiences. The more your partner just corrects you, if it's like, no, it wasn't 10 wild dogs, it was only 3 wild dogs, it often sort of puts a halt, right, to the collective, the interdependent process. Very interestingly, it turns out that's not the case for siblings, right? We're working a lot with these same tasks with siblings. Siblings correct each other and swear at each other all the time. You idiot, there were only three wild dogs, and that actually promotes their memory performance, right? Because presumably with siblings, there's no risk of love being lost, right? You're my sibling forever, so it's okay for me to correct you. Whereas with a relationship, right, it's not so clear. A correction might be worse. Thank you. So what we're trying to do is look at the functions of remembering together as not just a matter of tracking the past successfully, not just a matter of keeping track of past events, but of also building bridges into the future, of maintaining the relationship, of building single and group identity. That's all. Thank you.